What do you think about the term toxic masculinity?
I think it's a toxic term. It escaped from the margins of academia in 2016, not coincidentally, and just became a term that was used to apply essentially to any behavior by boys and men that the user disapproved of. It's rarely defined without any specificity at all, and so it in a sense is a completely vacuous term. But it's worse than that, because by putting those two words right next to each other, it actually repels a lot of boys and men from a conversation about what it means to be a man, what it means to be particularly mature. I think to talk about mature masculinity and immature masculinity is quite useful. But the idea of toxic, it's like Puritan. It reminds me of the idea of original sin in Christian theology, is right. And you need these exorcisms. You need someone to come and exorcise it. If you just weren't so male, you'd be okay. And having raised 3 boys to adulthood, I got to tell you, that idea that there's something toxic in them that has to be expunged is not a helpful way to raise them. And so if we could just consign that particular term back to the obscurity of academic journals, that would be great.
Where did it come from?
It was originally from work that was being done with very violent incarcerated prisoners. And so there were a couple of academics that were using it to talk about ways in which very violent men who were sort of serving long prison sentences, how their views of masculinity had become intertwined with ideas of expressed violence and dominance and so on too. And so it was a concept that was being used by a few psychologists, but I think it was mentioned 5 times a year in academic journals until 2016, and then overnight it was on the front page of every newspaper, and so it escaped. So I think it did have some value in the sense that there may be a very small group of men for whom actually their sense of what it means to be male has in some ways become toxic, but it was always this tiny minority of men for whom it was ever useful to apply it. And then suddenly Donald Trump got elected, Me Too, etc., and there you go.
I've heard you say that it's a catch-all term to use when one finds the behavior of any man offensive or unpleasant. And that's so correct. It's gone from being something that's an aberration, a complete outlier, to anything which is just slightly objectionable.
Yeah, that's the problem with it, is that there are many problems with it, but like any of these terms, if it just expands and expands and expands, so everything, I think I just did a quick search around and discovered that everything from climate change to COVID to war to is the result of toxic masculinity. And if there was resistance to getting vaccinated, it was toxic masculinity. If you make a pass, it's toxic masculinity. And it was just like and actually there was this I talk about this in my book. There was this incident at my kids' high school that got international attention as an expression of toxic masculinity, which really woke me up to the way this term is being sort of thrown around and used indiscriminately. But as I say, it's not just vacuous; it's actively harmful. And interesting, a lot of feminists will say that now too. There's a lot of people like Helen Lewis, who writes The Atlantic and so on. They're just saying, look, this term is not helping us. It's actually pushing men away from a conversation about masculinity, and can we please stop using it? And so this is not a right-wing view at all. It's actually one that a lot of feminists are just looking at the data and saying, if the goal here is to have a good conversation with boys and men about what it means to be boys and men, this is not the way in. It's a terrible frame for that conversation.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.